Nerissa Vale thought she was stepping into a life of luxury, while Zahir Al-Mansur believed his fortune could buy eternal youth. But as Rayven Calder, Elira Vaughn, and Davian Cross circled closer into their deadly web, the private jet that symbolized wealth soon became the stage for betrayal, greed, and murder. Nerissa Vale arrived in Dubai with a sense of wonder that bordered on obsession. For years, she had seen the glittering city splashed across travel magazines and social media feeds, but stepping into it herself felt surreal. She was 27, carrying a history of struggle behind her and an ambition that burned like fire within. For Nerissa, this trip wasn't just about sightseeing, it was about possibilities, connections, and the pursuit of a life she felt was always out of reach. The luxury around her, from the towering skyscrapers to the endless gold displays in the souks, fed into a hunger she could never quite silence. Every step through the pristine streets only confirmed to her that she belonged in this world, not as a visitor, but as someone who could claim a piece of it. Her entrance into this glamorous world was not accidental. Nerissa knew how to position herself, how to catch the right eyes, and how to stand out among a sea of tourists and wealthy residents. She was beautiful, with a magnetic presence that drew people toward her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that suggested she was accustomed to the very luxury she secretly longed for. In truth, she came from modest means, her family back in Malaysia never having seen wealth beyond necessity. Nerissa, however, wanted more, and in Dubai, she saw the opportunity to create the version of herself she had always imagined. It was at a resort near Jumeirah Beach that fate, or perhaps calculated chance, introduced her to Zahir Al-Karim. Zahir was unlike anyone she had ever encountered before. At 70, he was old enough to be her grandfather, yet he exuded a power that made him appear timeless. His name carried weight in Dubai and beyond. He was one of the last true oil magnates, a man who had seen fortunes rise and collapse, but always kept his empire intact. For him, money was no longer a measure of success. It was the air he breathed. And people around him treated him with deference, aware of the reach of his influence. Zahir noticed Nerissa quickly. She was different from the usual women who hovered around him, desperate to be seen at his side. Nerissa wasn't obvious in her approach. She didn't rush toward him or try to flatter him, and instead, she lingered just enough to spark his interest. Zahir, accustomed to being surrounded by opportunists, was drawn in by her calm allure. He saw in her a reminder of youth, of vitality, of something he had long since lost. For Nerissa, it was exactly the reaction she had hoped for. Their introduction came under the warmth of the Dubai sun, the kind of moment that seemed ordinary yet would alter the course of both their lives. Zahir invited her into his circle, a place filled with men in suits and women dripping in jewels, a world where money seemed endless and consequences were always managed behind closed doors. Nerissa adapted quickly. She fit into the image, smiling at the right moments, speaking with poise, and listening intently whenever Zahir spoke. But beneath her polished exterior, her mind was racing. She was already calculating what it would mean to be close to him. His wealth wasn't just about private yachts and jets. It was power in its purest form. Nerissa's ambition whispered that this was her chance to step out of the shadows of ordinary life and into something extraordinary. To her, Zahir wasn't simply an older man showing interest. He was the gateway to everything she had ever wanted. Zahir too felt something shift inside him. Though age had slowed his body, his mind remained sharp, and he knew the risks of inviting someone new into his life. But Nerissa's presence disarmed him. She carried a mix of innocence and mystery that blurred his judgment. To him, she was a spark of life, a dangerous temptation he couldn't resist. As days turned into nights filled with glittering city lights, Nerissa grew more firmly planted in his world. She dined at tables she had only ever seen in magazines, wearing dresses that shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Zahir introduced her to his acquaintances, proud to have her by his side. Every gesture, every luxury offered, pulled Nerissa deeper into the life she desired. Yet even in those early moments, the path ahead was darker than either of them could see. The bond forming between them looked like romance to outsiders, but in reality it was the beginning of a dangerous entanglement. For Nerissa, each smile was measured, each glance carefully constructed. She wasn't falling in love, she was setting a stage, and for Zahir every gift and every word of affection was blinding him further, anchoring him to a woman who carried secrets behind her eyes. What began as an innocent meeting by the beach resort was already turning into something neither of them could control. The glamour of Dubai was only the surface. Beneath it, betrayal was beginning to stir, waiting for the moment to show itself. And in Nerissa's heart, the hunger for power was louder than the whispers of conscience. The story of their connection was just beginning, but the ending had already written itself in shadow. Zahir al-Karim's world revolved around wealth, status and control, and yet when Nerissa Vale entered it, the dynamic shifted in ways he had not anticipated. He had built an empire through calculated risks, ruthless decisions, and alliances that stretched from the Middle East to Europe. Yet, with Nerissa, he allowed himself to show vulnerability. He brought her into his inner circle with a level of openness that surprised even his closest advisors. To him, she wasn't just another companion. She was a reminder of vitality, a symbol of life outside the monotonous rituals of power and business. He began to feel as though she gave him something money couldn't buy, youthful admiration. For Nerissa, the gifts and attention were intoxicating. Diamonds appeared on her wrists, luxury handbags found their way into her wardrobe, and private dinners on rooftops overlooking the Dubai skyline became routine. Each gesture from Zahir was more extravagant than the last, but Nerissa wasn't blinded by jewels or trips in chauffeur-driven cars. She was watching carefully, noting his habits, the way his staff moved around him, the security measures in place, and most importantly the vulnerabilities that slipped through the cracks of his empire. At night, when Zahir's world quieted down and the parties ended, Nerissa would retreat to her hotel suite, or one of his villas, and write in her leather-bound journal. Her entries were meticulous, documenting everything from the layout of his private office, to the way he trusted his personal assistant with confidential documents. The journal became her secret weapon, a collection of observations that revealed how a man who seemed untouchable could in fact be deceived. Zahir meanwhile was unaware of the duality in her presence. He grew more open, speaking of his past and the betrayals he had endured. Nerissa listened with calculated patience, appearing sympathetic while extracting fragments of information that would later prove invaluable. He spoke of rivals who sought his downfall, of politicians who demanded bribes, and of offshore accounts where his fortune was quietly stored. To most, these admissions would have been harmless. But to Nerissa, every detail was another thread she could weave into her growing plan. The relationship was not without suspicion. Zahir's long-time acquaintances whispered behind his back, questioning her intention. To them, Nerissa was too young, too ambitious, too perfectly positioned. But Zahir dismissed their concerns, convinced that he could distinguish between opportunism and genuine affection. Nerissa reinforced this belief by presenting herself as someone who simply admired him, who was grateful for his attention, and who longed for stability after a life of uncertainty. The truth was far more dangerous. Behind the curtain of affection, Nerissa was already laying foundations for betrayal. She began contacting an old acquaintance from Kuala Lumpur, a man named Rayven Calder. He was known for orchestrating scams and manipulating wealthy targets, and Nerissa trusted his cunning as much as she feared it. She didn't reveal everything to him, but she shared enough to spark his interest. Together they began sketching out ways to exploit Zahir's trust, not just for a quick profit, but for a life-changing theft. Rayven urged her to think bigger, to focus on more than jewelry or money transfers. He wanted access to accounts, investments, and the empire itself. Nerissa hesitated at first, aware of the dangers of crossing someone like Zahir. Yet the more she experienced luxury, the more desperate she became to make it permanent. A plan was taking shape, one that involved patience, deception, and time. In Zahir's eyes, Nerissa was blossoming into the perfect partner. He invited her to exclusive gatherings, where oil magnates and politicians discussed global deals. She sat quietly at his side, observing, learning, and collecting details that Zahir never realized she was storing away. Her charm disarmed those around her, and soon even his skeptical associates softened, convinced she was merely a beautiful young woman, swept into his orbit. But the cracks were beginning to show in their carefully curated image. Nerissa's eyes often lingered too long on documents Zahir left unattended. Her curiosity about his travel schedules raised subtle alarms with his staff, and yet, every time suspicion grew, she countered it with a gesture of affection, or a carefully placed word that erased doubt. She was mastering the art of walking a razor's edge between suspicion and trust. For Nerissa, the relationship was never about love. It was a calculated performance, one that demanded discipline and patience. Each day she grew closer to the core of Zahir's empire, and each night she documented her findings with a precision that bordered on obsession. Her ambition was growing faster than her caution, and soon she would be faced with a choice that would determine whether she secured the life she craved, or walked into a danger far greater than she could imagine. Zahir, oblivious to the danger he was nurturing, continued to believe he had found a woman who could bring meaning to his twilight years. He had faced rivals in boardrooms and courts, but he never anticipated that his greatest threat would come not from his enemies, but from the woman who smiled at him across candlelit dinner. The affair was deepening, but its foundation was already laced with poison, waiting for the right moment to spread. Zahir al-Karim prided himself on living a life without boundaries. Where others saw limitations, he saw opportunities, and that mindset had built his empire. It was also the reason he relied so heavily on his private jet. For Zahir, the aircraft wasn't just a tool for travel, it was an extension of his power. He could step aboard in Dubai and land in London, Paris, or New York with the confidence that he was always ahead of his competitor. When he invited Nerissa Vale to join him on one of his trips to Europe, it wasn't unusual. What made it different was the purpose simmering beneath Nerissa's carefully polished smile. To Nerissa, the invitation was a signal that her plan was moving forward. For weeks, she had studied Zahir's patterns, gathered secrets, and nurtured her connection with Rayven Calder. Their late-night communications were discreet, but filled with strategy. Rayven urged her to be bold, reminding her that proximity to a man like Zahir was rare and fleeting. Nerissa knew he was right. If she didn't act soon, she risked becoming another forgotten companion in Zahir's long line of relationships. The jet, enclosed and isolated thousands of feet above the ground, was the perfect stage to put their plan into motion. Preparations were meticulous. Nerissa made mental notes of the crew and their responsibilities. She observed the way Zahir stored his belongings, the briefcases he always carried, and the way he relaxed when inside the privacy of his aircraft. Unlike hotels or public gatherings, the jet created a bubble where Zahir let his guard down. That was the vulnerability she intended to exploit. The night before their flight, Nerissa sat alone in her suite, staring at her reflection. The weight of what she was planning pressed against her chest, but the thought of walking away felt impossible. She was already too deep into the game, her hunger for wealth too great. With her journal beside her, she reviewed her notes one last time. There were codes, account numbers Zahir had carelessly mentioned, and details about his offshore holdings. If she could get to them, the fortune would be enough to erase every struggle she had ever faced. When the day of departure arrived, everything unfolded like a dream. The black cars lined up at the private terminal, attendants greeted them with practiced smiles, and the jet gleamed beneath the morning sun. Zahir looked rejuvenated, energized by the idea of mixing business with the pleasure of her company. Nerissa held his arm, her face glowing with admiration, though inside her mind ran with calculations. Once aboard, the luxury was overwhelming. The interior was outfitted with cream leather seats, polished wood panels, and a bar stocked with the rarest spirit. To Nerissa, it was both beautiful and suffocating. Every object reminded her of the stakes, of the fortune within reach, and of the risks if she failed. She watched Zahir carefully, waiting for the right moments, studying his movements, as if each action was a code to be unlocked. What Nerissa didn't know was that she wasn't the only one making silent plans. Zahir, experienced in the treacherous world of business, had long ago learned that appearances could be deceptive. He had seen partners betray him, allies turn against him, and fortunes vanish overnight. Though he allowed himself to be charmed by Nerissa, a shadow of suspicion still lingered in his mind. Without revealing it to her, he had arranged for additional security measures on this flight. One of the attendants wasn't part of the usual crew. She blended in seamlessly, but her real job was to observe. As the jet climbed higher into the clouds, Nerissa felt the air tighten. The moment she had been preparing for was here. She had concealed a small vial in her handbag, something Rayven had provided as a tool to weaken Zahir temporarily. Her plan was to slip it into his drink, wait until his strength faded, and then act quickly to access what she needed from his documents. Timing was everything, and the isolation of the sky ensured there would be no interruptions. Zahir, however, carried himself with the ease of a man in control. He poured champagne toasted to their journey, and leaned back with a satisfied smile. To him, the flight was routine, another step in his endless cycle of meetings and deals. To Nerissa, it was the edge of a cliff. Every heartbeat reminded her of the choice she was about to make, a choice that would alter both their lives forever. The jet hummed steadily above the earth, its passengers wrapped in silence, luxury, and secrets. For Nerissa, this wasn't just another flight. It was the beginning of a betrayal crafted in shadows, a betrayal she believed would end with her walking into a new life. What she didn't realize was that the same walls protecting her plan were also closing in around her, carrying hidden players who were waiting for her first move. The cabin was hushed except for the steady hum of the engines, as the jet cut through the sky at 40,000 feet. Nerissa Vale had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for weeks, and now, as Zahir Al-Karim leaned back in his seat, the opportunity presented itself with terrifying clarity. He lifted a crystal flute of champagne to his lips, unaware that the liquid he swallowed carried a secret. The faintest trace of a sedative had been slipped into his drink moments earlier, a gesture masked behind Nerissa's practiced smile. She watched him closely, her pulse quickening as every second stretched into something heavier than the last. Zahir's hand trembled slightly as he set the glass back on the polished wood of the table. At first he dismissed the sensation as fatigue. He had lived long enough to know the strain of constant travel, the toll it took on even the strongest body. But the unease grew quickly. His vision blurred, his chest tightened, and the strength he had always relied upon seemed to slip from his grasp. Nerissa leaned toward him with an expression of concern that was only partly genuine. Her fingers brushed against his, steadying him, while her eyes darted to the leather briefcase secured beside his seat. Inside that briefcase lay the very documents she had been waiting for. Codes, account numbers, investment records, all of it was the key to Zahir's empire. If she could reach them, she would finally hold the fortune that would liberate her from the life she had always despised. She felt a surge of triumph as she unlatched the case and glanced at the folders within. Her heart raced with the thrill of being so close to victory. But before her fingers could sweep across the papers, a voice shattered the fragile silence. It was calm, measured, and entirely unexpected. Elira Vaughn, one of the attendants, stood behind her with an expression Nerissa couldn't read. Until this moment, Elira had blended into the background with quiet efficiency, refilling glasses and adjusting trays. Now her presence felt different, commanding, even threatening. Nerissa froze, the papers still half pulled from the case, as Elira's eyes locked onto her. Elira revealed her true identity, not with a flourish, but with simple, devastating certainty. She was not an ordinary attendant. She was an investigator, hired by Zahir months earlier, after suspicions had crept into his mind about Nerissa's intention. He had allowed the affair to blossom, knowing full well that danger often wore the mask of beauty. Elira's mission had been to watch, record and wait for the moment when Nerissa's performance would collapse into reality. Panic surged through Nerissa as the weight of the revelation crashed down on her. The plane's elegant cabin suddenly felt like a cage, its walls closing in around her. She tried to compose herself, feigning innocence, but the evidence was damning: the half-open briefcase, Zahir's weakened state, and the vial hidden in her handbag. Her perfect plan, the one she had built with patience and precision, was unraveling before her eyes. Zahir, though weakened, managed to lift his gaze toward her. His expression carried both betrayal and grim vindication. He had given her access, trusted her presence, and now saw the mask slip. For Nerissa, the sting of being outmaneuvered was unbearable. She had believed herself to be the master of the game, but Zahir had been playing his own hand all along. Yet the chaos didn't end with the revelation. As Elira restrained Nerissa, securing her wrists with practiced efficiency, another layer of deceit revealed itself. The co-pilot, Davian Stroud, had been silent throughout the flight, a background figure, whose presence rarely drew attention. But now his actions began to shift. He lingered near the controls with attention in his movements, his gaze sharp and calculated. Unlike Elira, Davian was not loyal to Zahir. He had his own agenda, one that Nerissa had not anticipated, and Zahir had failed to foresee. As Nerissa struggled against Elira's grip, she noticed the change in Davian's demeanor. It was subtle at first, the flick of a switch, the faintest hesitation before responding to the captain's instructions, but soon it became undeniable. Davian was steering the situation toward a darker path, and the jet that had once symbolized Zahir's dominance was becoming the center of a storm no one had control over. The betrayal Nerissa had carefully orchestrated had exposed her, but it had also revealed something far more dangerous. She wasn't the only predator on this flight. The skies above were no longer safe, and the true threat was only beginning to make itself known. The luxury cabin, filled with whispered secrets and stolen glances, had transformed into a battleground of hidden motives. And as the jet sailed over the endless expanse of clouds, the balance of power shifted again, leaving Nerissa, Zahir and Elira all caught in a web spun tighter than any of them had imagined. The air inside the jet grew heavier with each passing minute, the cabin once filled with elegance now soaked in tension. Nerissa Vale sat restrained, her wrists bound by Elira Vaugh's practiced hand. The sedative in Zahir Al-Karim's system left him pale and weak, though his sharp eyes still carried the weight of accusation. Elira, calm but alert, kept her focus on Nerissa, believing the crisis was contained. But the hum of the engines seemed different now, uneven, and it was then that Davian Stroud, the co-pilot, stepped fully out of the shadows. Davian had always been considered reliable, a man of few words who executed his duties without question. Zahir valued discretion, and Davian provided. Yet beneath his quiet exterior lay resentment that had festered for years. He had flown Zahir across continents, watched him bask in luxury, and endured his arrogance. Davian was a skilled pilot, but in Zahir's world, he was merely another employee, replaceable, invisible, and underpaid, despite the billions flowing through the magnate's hand. Resentment had transformed into a dangerous alliance, one forged in secrecy, with Rayven Calder the same shadowy figure, guiding Nerissa. Rayven had not placed all his bets on Nerissa. He had anticipated failure, knowing betrayal often led to collapse. To secure his plans, he reached out to Davian, promising him a share of the fortune if he played his role at the right moment. That moment had arrived. As Elira tightened her hold on Nerissa, Davian slipped back into the cockpit. His hands moved with deliberate intent across the controls, altering the flight path. The jet tilted subtly, the change barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but the shift in pressure told Nerissa immediately that something was wrong. She turned her head sharply, her pulse quickening, and realized the betrayal she had thought she orchestrated was spiraling into something she could no longer control. Zahir, though weakened, sensed it too. He tried to speak, his voice strained, warning Elira with a glance.
But before he could gather the strength to act, the jet shuddered violently. Elira steadied herself, her eyes narrowing as the realization set in. The danger was no longer confined to Nerissa. Something far larger was unfolding. Davian's voice crackled over the intercom, steady but cold. He announced a false mechanical issue, masking his sabotage as a technical failure. On the radar, the jet's course shifted toward the outskirts of Athens, far from the original plan. Elira moved quickly, dragging Nerissa to the rear of the cabin, and strapping her into a seat, her own training telling her that chaos was imminent. Nerissa's mind raced as she pieced the puzzle together. Rayven had played her using her ambition as a distraction, while placing his real trust in Davian. The sense of control Nerissa had once savored was gone. She was no longer the hunter, she was prey, trapped in the same snare she had tried to set. Her chest tightened as panic flooded her. The betrayal she had planned for Zahir had been twisted back upon her, and she realized that Rayven had never intended for her to succeed. She was expendable, just another pawn in his larger scheme. Inside the cockpit, Davian disengaged communications, isolating the sky outside was clear, the sun illuminating the white clouds beneath them, a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside. Elira forced her way toward the cockpit, determined to stop him, but Davian had already locked the reinforced door. She pounded against it, shouting, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of engines, straining under unnatural commands. Zahir summoned what strength he could, struggling to stand. He looked at Nerissa with an expression that mixed fury with pity. He had survived countless betrayals in his lifetime, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. For once his wealth and power were meaningless. In the confined walls of his own jet, he was as vulnerable as any man. The aircraft began its descent, the sudden drop sending drinks tumbling from tables and unsecured items crashing to the floor. Nerissa clutched the armrests, her mind flashing between fear and disbelief. This wasn't how her story was supposed to end. She had dreamed of walking away with riches, not being dragged down into another man's revenge. At the last moment, Davian leveled the jet, guiding it toward an emergency strip on the outskirts of Athens. The landing was brutal, wheels screeching, metal groaning under the strain. Passengers and crew were thrown violently, but the jet stayed intact, skidding to a halt in a cloud of smoke and debris. When the doors finally opened, sirens wailed in the distance as emergency vehicles rushed to the scene. Elira, shaken but alive, emerged first, pulling Nerissa behind her in restraints. Zahir was carried out on a stretcher, his survival uncertain but his name already echoing through headlines. Davian, however, was gone. Before authorities reached the cockpit, he had vanished into the chaos, leaving behind only unanswered questions, and a trail that pointed back to Rayven Calder. For Nerissa, the nightmare had only just begun. Arrested on the tarmac, her face splashed across international news, she realized she had been nothing more than a pawn in a web of greed and vengeance. The affair that began with luxury and desire had ended in fire, betrayal and ruin aboard a private jet. And in the shadows, the true mastermind watched from afar, untouched as the world unraveled for everyone else.